George Martin's Game of Thrones has become a real phenomenon of popular culture. It was able to reach this special status after the classic fantasy saga of Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings. Of course, there are stories like Harry Potter or Twilight and such, but these are not real so-called high fantasies. These are not bringing back the ancient, heroic eposes of our culture. These are not following the settings, the grandiosity and the drama of Homer's Iliad. In this sense, there are only these two. The status of The Lord of the Rings is unquestionable. However, with Game of Thrones there are some concerning signs, both in the case of the books and the TV series, suggesting that a fast fall will follow the fast rise of the story. So what is the hidden secret of the huge and fast success of Game of Thrones, and why have we become so disappointed in it? In this video we'll shed light on this contradiction and we'll find out that the reason of the fast rise and the concerning signs are in fact the same, the moment Ser Ilyn's sword strikes the neck of Lord Eddard Stark. We are curious, we're looking for the reasons, we want to find the truth, but we tend to forget that truth starts with ourselves. Look behind the mirror and find the path. This channel is about science and philosophy, so it's quite clear why we deal with science fiction. Just watch our last video. Science fiction holds a mirror before us to better understand what science and the modern world based on science really are. But fantasy? Why should we care about legends and strange worlds, not to mention wizards and warriors? Science fiction is about our future, but why do we care about these false images of our legendary past? Of course, we're not interested in magic, it's not a real thing, but science is also not everything. And there's a reason that fantasy became popular in the last decades. Because it also holds an important mirror before us, only another kind of mirror. So what is the secret of epic high fantasy, and of course, why Game of Thrones? It's clear that science is the most important institution of the modern world. At some point, we even believe that everything should be strictly grounded on science, and this would lead us to a brave new world. And science fiction, of course, should explore this grandiose vision. What would arise as problems? What would be the solutions, the alternatives, etc. However, in the third millennium, in this so-called postmodern world, we don't believe in this bright future based on science anymore. On the contrary, we see and fear global warming, pollution, nuclear weapons, the rise of the machines. As a consequence, classic, positive science fiction has become dead, and dystopias and fantasy took their places. We know that science is not everything, we fear the future and search for the lost pieces in the mirror. High fantasy, especially Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, is perhaps the most important and successful answer for what we've lost. We lost the clear picture of what's good and what's wrong, what our higher obligations are, what self-devotion and real heroism is, not just for ourselves but for our whole world and civilization. Tolkien reached back into our forgotten legendary past, into an idealistic world to remind us, to show us who we really are, or should be, if we could see through the materialistic knickknacks of our modern era, which in this sense are just blurring the big picture. Science and philosophy were born in ancient Greece. However, for the ancient Greeks it was always clear that the real theoretical foundation of their civilization was Homer's Iliad. Why? Because for them it was always obvious that science, scientific knowledge and technology were in fact based on these deeper and earlier foundations of human life and culture, so in no way it could be the basic foundation of anything. It's a really long story why the modern Western man thought the opposite and, as a consequence, lost the real foundations of his life and culture. Nonetheless, the point is that now we once again recognize the ancient wisdom of the Greeks. Or at least Tolkien really did. He found and brought back what was lost. He of course used the same grandiose literary framework of the ancient eposes, which is unquestionably the best, if not the only genre for the job. Okay, but if Tolkien was so brilliant and now we can really understand his genius, then why do we feel that something is still missing? Why has a new, grandiose epos started to outshine it? Is there still some problems with The Lord of the Rings? Or to put it in another way, why have we started to love George Martin's Game of Thrones so much? Especially us, who always missed something in The Lord of the Rings way before the TV adaptation of Martin's book series. Is it because, according to today's supposition, we love its explicit sexual and violent content? No, not really. There are numerous books, movies and series that are way better in this regards. This is just the surface. We love Game of Thrones because it's a high epic fantasy that seems much more realistic than The Lord of the Rings. For instance, it has Jaime instead of Aragorn, or in the case of Great Small Men, it has Tyrion instead of Bilbo. It's complex both in the sense of the characters and the story. It's unpredictable, it's shocking, it promises so much. To put it simply, Tolkien brought back the mythical spirit of Homer's Iliad. But contrary to the ancient Greeks, we perfectly know that it's not quite real. There's no Sauron and there are no immortal elves because there's no absolute evil, just as there's no absolute good. Yes, The Lord of the Rings has so many important messages, morals and greatness we are really thirsty for. But we want something more because The Lord of the Rings is still not real and cannot be real because it cannot deal with the complexity and novelty of the modern world, that the head of the hero sometimes falls into the dirt. The genius of George Martin and the greatness of Game of Thrones are in turn truly manifested in this dramatic, unpredictable moment, the beheading of Ned Stark. It's not only the main turning point of the story that carpenters the stage and presents the main promises of the story, but a powerful symbol that defines the new postmodern philosophy of Martin in contrast to the old concept of Tolkien's traditional Christian values and ethics. At that moment, when Ser Ilyn's sword stroked down, everybody could feel that this story is animated by the modern spirit, that despite of the medieval costumes and the imaginary world of Westeros, it's not about the past and it isn't naive or illusory in any sense. No, it's really our drama, the drama of the modern man who feels lost, as if somebody or something have stripped him of his most precious values and beliefs, as if he's been betrayed by his own motives and narrow-mindedness. Although we were shocked beyond imagination and felt that it was the most unpredictable moment of any drama, it was already prepared in the first scene of the story. The great Lord Eddard Stark didn't believe in the most important thing he should have believed in, the others, who were seen by Will, the young ranger of the Night's Watch. So instead he chopped off the poor lad's head. This is once again the real brilliance of George Martin. We were deceived by Lord Eddard Stark's honesty, chivalry and heroism. We thought that he lost his head because he was betrayed, because he was the only one who still preserved the real morals and values of the past. But that wasn't the case at all. In the deep dramatic sense, our glorious hero beheaded himself because he didn't stick to his most important belief and he wasn't able to realize the real danger he should have faced. He again and again said that winter is coming, but didn't believe, didn't understand the real meaning of his own words. The others are here. Instead, he blindly decapitated Will because a madman sees what he wants to see. This is the deep dramatic reason why Ned Stark wasn't just an epic hero, but a lost, non-believer modern hero. But if Martin was so smart, and if we love Game of Thrones, then why did we become so disappointed in it? Why have we started to feel that something is really missing? Why and how did the fast fall of Game of Thrones happen after its fast and glorious rise? Because the next book has been delayed for years? Because there were stupid mistakes after the 4th season? No, of course not. Unfortunately, there are deeper reasons which we perceive in the same way as we've done so with the genius of George Martin regarding the beheading of Lord Eddard Stark. The fall of Ned wasn't just unpredictable and shocking, but laid down the unique promises of the story both in a dramatic and in a moral sense. Until that point, his children as well as his wife, Cat, were only our secondary heroes who provided depth for the story and widened the perspective. However, at that point they have become our main heroes, and it was clear that by stepping into the shoes of their great but failed father, they would realize the dramatic and moral promises of the story. That they would fight and defeat both the inner and outer enemies of Westeros. But this promise never happened and never will. This is the basic reason we feel that something is missing. Perhaps we even feel betrayed by Martin. We appreciated his genius modern turn, but waited for a classic ending according to the basic rules of great eposes. And what did we get instead? Sansa was brutalized, terrorized, even raped. Arya was lost and kidnapped over and over again and became a cold-blooded killing machine. Bran's suffering story became so slow and pointless that at the end he became part of a tree. But the main problem starts with the so-called Red Wedding. Martin went all in and repeated the same story with Robb and Cat. Seemingly, the oldest brother stepped into the shoes of their father. Then he, as his father, was so narrow-minded that beheaded one of his own men and at the end was also betrayed and killed in a more shocking fashion than his father. At that moment, we weren't just shocked, we were horrified. From a certain perspective, Martin's brave all-in could have worked because it was even more shocking and more unpredictable than the beheading of Ned Stark. We simply couldn't believe that he was so brilliant, or rather crazy at this point, that he would repeat it. And it could have worked because it was the repacked version of the truly brilliant murder of Ned Stark. However, from another angle, it was never really going to work, and we could have felt that because it lacked originality. There wasn't a unique, dramatic depth to why Robb and Cat should die as it was in the case of Ned Stark. On the contrary, according to the promises of the story and the classic rules of epic fantasy, Robb should have become our real hero who would defeat the enemies of his betrayed father. Furthermore, at this point, this storyline had nothing to do with the real enemies of Westeros, the others. In this sense, it became utterly unfocused. So the real meaning of this moment, which is clearly a choice of George Martin, is that the classic rules of drama and great epics do not apply in Game of Thrones. In other words, the beheading of Ned Stark isn't just a brilliant, unpredictable, modern turn which lays down the dramatic and moral premises of the story, but the new, unpredictable rule itself. And Martin applies this rule again and again, not just in the case of Ned Stark's children, but for example in the case of Oberyn Martell, Stannis Baratheon and Quentyn Martell. And he'll no doubt do it with the young Aegon Targaryen as he did it in a different manner in the case of Theon Greyjoy and Jaime Lannister. More and more side stories were born one after another just for the sake of the unpredictability rule. As a consequence, the story became more and more unfocused and empty. Yet the most crucial moment was when he applied his rule on our real hero Ned Stark's bastard son, Jon Snow. This was the moment when the unpredictability rule became so predictable that even Martin himself chose to break it, and in this way it became way worse because everybody knew perfectly well that Jon Snow would be resurrected. How did we know it? From enlarged and endlessly analyzed screenshots? No, not really. We knew it from the classical premises of the story, which until that point was all written by Martin's unpredictability rule. But at that point we already knew that Jon Snow is the real hero of Game of Thrones, that he's the real heir of the Targaryens, and he should fight off the main threat to Westeros, the fearsome White Walkers. However, after Ned, Robb, Stannis and the others, at that point of the story it was only a hollow turn which became its own sad parody. This is the reason that Game of Thrones only feels more realistic than The Lord of the Rings, but at the end it became clear that this is unfortunately only the surface. The beheading of Ned Stark is just like Marcel Duchamp's famous modern sculpture, The Fountain. It's unpredictable, it's shocking, it holds a mirror before the lost modern man, but because it breaks every classical rule of art which gives deeper meaning, usually both in the dramatic and moral sense, it becomes hollow and most of all, unrepeatable. It cannot be a positive rule of art. More precisely, if you choose to repeat it again and again, this process will show that it's nothing but an empty, postmodern, twisted brilliance. Unfortunately, the true deeper meaning we really love doesn't define the story anymore. Instead, it's the shock, the sex, the brutality, symbolized by Ramsay Bolton, Joffrey Baratheon, and the other numerous psychopaths of Game of Thrones. Martin's story is built on a brilliant turn which has a really deep meaning for the lost modern man. Furthermore, it's a high epic fantasy in the footsteps of the idealistic Lord of the Rings and Homer's old classics. This is the reason that it seems so realistic and promises so much. We can do nothing but love it. However, contrary to Tolkien or Homer, Martin is a typical postmodern artist who doesn't believe in classic formulas, promises, meaning, and most of all morals. He uses the elements of high epic fantasy, but clearly doesn't believe in them. If he was consistent, then he would have killed Jon Snow, but he didn't dare because that would have ended the story right away. But have no doubt, he'll never finish the promising ballad of the Song of Ice and Fire. Because in this postmodern way, no real epic fantasy can be consistently finished. In this video, we've taken a closer look on the philosophical meaning of high fantasy. We can find its roots in the classical epochs of our ancient past, so it can reflect those profound values and beliefs in dramatic form which we've lost or at least forgot in the fast pace and complexity of the modern world. The main deficiency of The Lord of the Rings is that it isn't able to deal with this complexity and novelty. It's too idealistic and thus unrealistic regarding the real problems of the modern world. George Martin's Game of Thrones, in turn, can brilliantly grab the tragedy of the modern hero, but it's still not able to deliver because it, unfortunately, denies the rules, values and morality of the classic eposes. It only operates with unpredictability and shocking effects, but doesn't realize its deeper promise. In our next video, we'll continue our former topic of artificial intelligence and try to explore the philosophical depth of AI and its relationship with men. Namely, we'll see if it's really possible to defy death by moving our consciousness into artificial bodies, or as we have seen in Westworld, into whole virtual realities, as so many scientists claim. If you liked it, please leave a like and subscribe, and remember, always look behind the mirror.